Hello, good morning. Welcome to episode 209 of Learn with Lorna. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, where we look after historic documents in Inverness, in Fort William, in Portree and in Wick. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we really appreciate that. So welcome to episode number 209. I'm so sorry that it's delayed by a few weeks. As you will know, I've not been well, so thank you so much for all your lovely messages and comments, and that's been really appreciated. So thank you. Hopefully on the mend. So this week we are looking at a really fascinating subject, one that is of interest to many people, and a subject that's been absolutely central to the lives of Highlanders for centuries, the stories of the churches at the hearts of our communities. And these are quite often some of the oldest buildings and institutions and groups within our communities, and things that have been right at the centre of what's happened over hundreds of years. I've always known I would have far too much to say in half an hour for this episode, so I think again it will be one that I return to again and again. I could easily have done several episodes just on the churches in Inverness. So I've had to select just a few stories to tell you from all the abbeys, priories, friaries, cathedrals, churches of numerous denominations and other places of worship across the Highlands and Islands. So I've selected just a few randomly that I think have great stories associated with them or interesting aspects, and I'm telling the stories of the churches themselves rather than the doings or the wrongdoings of their congregations. So I'm looking particularly at the story of that infrastructure of churches. So if you don't hear a story that you're expecting, or something that you think, why is she not telling that really important one, just forgive me, and perhaps I'll come back to it in a subsequent episode, or put it in the comments if there's a church that you think is of particular interest. Okay, so I'm going to start at the top of the Highlands and Islands. I'm going to start in Caithness with some notes put together for me by my colleagues in Nucleus about Dunnet and Ulrig churches. Dunnet Kirk is one of the oldest religious sites in Caithness, with the first written reference to a church in Dunnet appearing circa 1230. In 1275, the Bagimont roll, Bagimont, I'm not sure, concerning monies raised in support of the Crusades, records that the contribution from Dunnet was favourably compared with that raised in other parts of the diocese, which is interesting just to think that in Caithness they're contributing more money to the Crusades than in other parts. In 1837, a major construction is thought to have been carried out when the north aisle was added, and the raked wooden floor and box pews are thought to be from this time. In 1992, the roof was reslated. As well as having notable ministers, including that of Timothy Pont, really interesting. Timothy Pont was an early cartographer who was, many of you will know the name Pont, or if you don't, have a wee look, you'll see some of his maps. So as well as having notable ministers, including that of Timothy Pont from 1601 to 1610, and George Trail, father of James Trail, the originator of the Caithness flagstone industry on a commercial scale in 1751, the church is also home to a few myths and legends. One local legend says that from the small window in the west end of the tower, a lamp was lit on dark nights to guide home the fishing boats. Another involves a local fisherman finding a Selkie child on Dunnet Beach shore. Now, you'll remember the story of the Selkie child maybe from our Myths and Legends episodes. So there's been a really long connection to worship on that site, and also that intertwining that I've spoken about before of religion and superstition merging together, intertwining and playing a role in the story. Belief systems that weren't as at odds with each other as we might suspect. Now, Caithness, of course, has the most northerly churches on the British mainland, and just as Dunnet's history goes back a long way, some of the churches in Caithness are sited on land with a really long story of occupation and use, such as Canisby Church. Canisby Church is the most northerly church on the mainland of Scotland, and it is built on a mound covering the ruins of a broch. The Kirk session records run from 1652 to 1904, some of the earliest session records in Caithness. A T-shaped church was erected in 1720 at Canasby on the site of a previous church dedicated to St Rostan. Over the years there were alterations and additions to the church, like the Brabster aisle, which was constructed in 1724 and later became the main entrance to the church. An unusual tombstone is located inside the church at Canasby, that of Jan de Groot, the man who John o' Groats is named after, and who apparently built the octagonal house in John o' Groats. It is said that he came to Caithness from Holland and was the first to offer ferry crossings to Orkney, charging 4d per journey, and the old Scottish Forkney was named a groat in his honour. It seems like that's unlikely but possible. His tombstone reads, Donald Groot, son of John Groot, laid me here, April the 13th day of 1568, MDL. Likewise, and Donald Groot and his son, and his Donald, lad, and the forebearers of Donald. Hence, God called me the 13th day of April, 1568. This tombstone was first located inside the church at the east end, but it had been covered over at some point until 1893, when it was found and removed to sculptor John Nicholson's workshop for renovation, and then mounted on the outside wall of the south aisle until 1982, when it was once more placed inside the church to protect it from the elements, where it still sits to this day. Canasby was the church that the Queen Mother attended when she was visiting Caithness at the Castle of May between 1959 and 2001. And those aren't the only notable churches in Caithness. This is the story of Keith Baptist Church, which again is a really interesting. I got so fascinated writing these, of all the different stories that were coming out. Keith Baptist Church was the first Baptist church in Scotland, founded on New Year's Day 1750 at Keith Castle by Sir William Sinclair of Dunbeath. He was baptised at some point during his travels, and on his return to Caithness he immediately began to preach and engage in evangelism throughout Keith. Services were first held in a room within the castle, and then moved to Sir William's newly finished Keith House in 1754-1755, a short distance away. Baptisms would take place in the sea below the castle, along with regular fellowship meals. Singing was encouraged in this church. In fact, Sir William wrote and published a book of 60 hymns, which also included his own paraphrases of scriptures, which we hold a copy of at Nucleus. Sir William is also said to have followed the example set by Jesus in the Bible of washing other members' feet. He continued as pastor until 1763, when he left his estate in Caithness and moved to Edinburgh, appointing John Budge to take over. Upon his death in 1768, the congregation moved to a turf-built house, then a larger stone-built cottage with a thatched roof. John Budge led the church until his death in 1803. A proper chapel was built in 1844 by extending the building of the turf-built house, the work being completed by the congregation, including the quarrying of the stones. So really interesting that they did all of that work themselves. It was unusual at the time that this site would be given, because after the disruption of 1843, the creation of the Free Church, landowners were refusing to give sites to the Free Church. But the fact that the Keith Baptist Church was given land shows how well regarded they were. That church was completed in 1854 and could seat 200. Over time, the number in the congregation fluctuated, growing during the herring fishing of the 19th century and falling during the war years, until the year 2000, when Keith Baptist Church was officially merged with Wick Baptist Church, leaving the Keith building empty. But not before its 200th birthday was celebrated on New Year's Day by Kenneth Cormack, who walked to Old Keith Castle, the first meeting place of this church, to pray and give thanks for Sir William Sinclair and the legacy that he left behind. So some really fascinating aspects to that story, but that pattern of periods of growth and decline is one which is echoed in so many other churches, with the government and politics and societal change and war and so many other things affecting church attendance. So if we leave Caithness and come down a county and come to Sutherland, The first, second and third statistical accounts, compiled in the late 1700s, the mid 1800s and the mid 1900s, usually give information about each parish's ecclesiastical state. Because these were written by ministers, that's usually something that's of prime importance to them as they're detailing life in their parish. The first statistical account of 1793 for the parish of Edrahillis in Sutherland gives an insight into people's determination to attend church at the time this was written. 1793. Ecclesiastical state of this parish. Besides the parish church, there is a place appointed for public worship, and at the distance of 6 miles from it, on the north side of the Kyle of Inchard in Asher, where it is the incumbent's duty to officiate once in 6 weeks. But as the parish church is situated as commodiously as it possibly could be and pretty centrally upon the coast, the attendance of the parishioners there, especially in good weather, is rendered quite convenient, as boats can convey them easily from the most distant parts of the parish. The church has undergone several reparations in the last 20 years, now has a slated roof, is well seated, and is in every way fit for the accommodation of the parishioners. And I've said in the past that I think sometimes we forget how much of our ancestors' lives was lived by boat. That movement was easier to go by boat, to go round the coast. So to see that there, of the fact that it's been situated on the coast, I mean, Edrahillis is on the coast anyway, but the church is situated on the coast because most people then can get there by boat. The second statistical account for the parish of Farr in 1845 tells us that they too have a church on the coast, but that this is some 30 miles from the interior of the parish. But they say, so although a lot of people can get there, it's 30 miles away from some parts of the parish, but they say these remote parts are occupied only by a few shepherds. So, never mind, eh? That statistical account for the parish of Farr goes on to explain that the parish church seats about 750, and that 10 miles east there is another church seating 350. Almost everyone in the parish of Farr who attended to church went to one of these two, because it says in the statistical account there is no dissenting chapel in the parish, so no church that is not affiliated to the established church. And with the exception of one shepherd from the borders, who is of the anti-burgher persuasion, and a shepherd's wife from Lochaber, who is a Roman Catholic, there is not a dissenter of any description in this parish. And it also notes, which I found interesting, that in 1845 there was an average of 130 communicants. So really interesting that when the parish population is 2,100, those two churches seated nearly 1,200, and you've got 130 regular communicants in 1845. Okay, perhaps one of the most famous religious buildings in Sutherland is Dornoch Cathedral. We hold in our archives at Hark a collection of church guidebooks which include one written about Dornoch Cathedral, published in 1965. And it opens with a quote from 1 Chronicles 22 verse 5, "The house that is to be builded for the Lord must be exceeding magnifical." The opening paragraphs of the guidebook to Dornoch Cathedral read like this. When Bishop Gilbert de Moravia, 1222, selected Dornoch as the site of the principal church of the Diocese of Caithness, we'll come back to that because it's not in Caithness, he may have been influenced by the fact that a great part of the district in the neighbourhood of the town was already under the influence of the church. The bishopric appears to have been founded by Alexander I or David I, but long before the time of these monarchs, Dornoch was a centre of religious influence and the site of a Chaldee monastery. In the register of the Abbey of Dunfermline is a letter written in 1140 by David I, addressed to the Earls of Orkney and Caithness, praying that for the love of him they would protect the monks at Dornoch from injury and shame. And that's because 2 of the bishops had already been murdered. This guidebook goes on to detail the history of religious practice on the site, the connection to St Barre, who died in the 500s or 600s, and to St Gilbert de Moravia, who was elected to the bishopric of Caithness in 1222. And it was Gilbert who moved the seat of the bishopric from Halkirk in Caithness to Dornoch in Sutherland, and paid for the building of the cathedral church He paid for it and had 10 canons to minister to it. And it was when it was situated in Falkirk that those two had been murdered. Now, after Gilbert died in 1245, he became the last Scotsman, at the time this book was written anyway, to whom a place was given in the calendar of saints. So the 1st of April, if you are familiar with the calendar of saints, the 1st of April is the day attributed to Gilbert of Dornoch, St Gilbert of Dornoch, or Gilbert of Caithness. In 1570, Dornoch Cathedral was destroyed by a fire in a feud between the Murrays of Dornoch and the Mackays of Strathnaver, leaving only the tower and the steeple for a few years, and Gilbert's tomb was desecrated as well. So years of damage and neglect, and the repairs would take decades and decades. Now, in 1560, a big important period in Scottish religious history, the Scottish Parliament passed a number of acts breaking the Pope's authority of the Church in Scotland, abolishing Mass, and making Scotland officially a Protestant nation. This was when the Church of Scotland was formed. And we would go on past 1560, past the Reformation, to go through periods of Protestantism and Episcopalianism. And Dornoch Cathedral would go on to become the parish church, with more repairs and restorations being carried out through the 1830s. The guidebook is scathing about these. It said something along the lines of, having been built and constructed at the peak of church architectural vision and practice, it had the misfortune to be repaired at its very lowest ebb. So they say that these repairs carried out in the 1830s left the interior showing little of its ancient character. But that was rectified in 1924 for the cathedral's 700th anniversary, when renovation work uncovered a lot of the original stonework. And Dornoch Cathedral is very beautiful. If any of you are not familiar with it, then just type it into a search engine, you'll see some pictures. It's full of interesting things, from the stained glass windows, which tell many stories of their own, to the statues, memorials, and gargoyles. So no wonder some of you may know that Madonna chose to have her son christened here. So no wonder when it's got such an interesting history. So now 800 years old, Dornoch Cathedral, that guidebook finishes with the words, "It has withstood the ravages of time, an abiding witness to the glory of God and to the permanence of things spiritual amid the transience of all things earthly." If we move down from Sutherland into Ross and Cromarty, and I'm bypassing all manner of interesting churches and a cathedral and things as we go, but as I said, not enough time. We're going to look at Croik, right on the border between Sutherland and Ross and Cromarty, and this is one that maybe some of you would be expecting me to include. Croik Church today is famous for its connection to the Highland clearances, and some of its history is held through this booklet that we hold. Following the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Westminster Parliament, as a thanks offering for victory, voted funds for the building of 43 churches and manses to become known as the parliamentary churches in the remoter parts of the Highlands, where the local landlords were prepared to offer sites. The designs chosen were those of the famous engineer Thomas Telford, the builder of the Caledonian Canal. The government also agreed to provide stipends of £120 a year for the ministers of these new parishes. Croik, which lies some 10 miles west of Ardguy up Strathcarron, was offered by the Rosses of Balnagowan as a site for one of these churches, possibly because it was already a well-established preaching station. A Pictish broch was incorporated within the boundaries of the glebe. The building of this church was completed in 1827 at a cost of £1,426, and its first minister, Robert Williamson, was inducted in September 1828. He would stay until 1840, when he emigrated to Nova Scotia, taking some of his congregation with him. The population of Croik Parish at the time that the church was built was made up, as in many other parts of the Highlands, of small tenants who practised subsistence farming on patches of arable land in the straths and from sheelings on the hill grazings. By the end of the 18th century, commercial sheep farming was being introduced in the Highlands, being introduced in the Highlands in general and into Rossshire in particular by Sir John Lockhart Ross of Balnagowan. As it became progressively adopted by the landowners, this brought a complete change to the lives of the tenants. These changes, known as the clearances, did not reach Croik parish until 1842, when James Galanders, factor to the Robertsons of Candace, attempted to evict the tenants of their Glencalvy property in order to make way for sheep. His efforts were at first strongly and successfully resisted, but he eventually succeeded on the 24th of May 1845, when 18 families, 90 people, were cleared from their homes in Glencalvy, in which they had lived for generations. Prior to their departure, many took shelter in improvised booths erected in the Croik churchyard, and their wretched plight is recorded in the messages they scratched on the outside east window of the church. It so happened that a special correspondent from the Times newspaper witnessed these events, and a facsimile of his graphic dispatch to his editor in London reporting them has been placed within the church. It includes a reproduction of the scratched messages etched into the window glass. A further clearance from Greenyards in Strathconnan in March 1854, which came to be known as the Massacre of the Rosses, is also recorded in a message on the window. If we cross over to the west coast of Ross and Cromarty, we're going to look at a leaflet that we hold that tells the history of Gairloch Church. The present parish church was erected in 1791-92, but on the same site as earlier buildings which existed from at least the middle of the 13th century. Christianity came very early to this area, having been introduced by St Maura, a disciple of St Columba of Iona, about AD 673. He founded a monastery at Applecross and then travelled widely throughout the Highlands preaching the gospel until his death in 722 at the age of 80. He established a cell on Isle Marie in Lochmarie, which is named after him. In the following centuries, the Celtic Church, which had spread throughout Scotland, gave way to the Roman Catholic Church, and it is reasonable to suppose that it was thereafter represented in Gairloch, at least by a few pious priests during the turbulence of the various clan conflicts. Certainly Isle Marie became a residence of a priest, and 2 churches were established, one on the island and one at Gairloch. It is recorded in an early Latin document that the church at Gairloch, both in parsonage and vicarage, became a common church of the Cathedral of Ross shortly after 1255, so it must have existed prior to that date. And it seems that this church was on the site of the present one. This history goes on to state that the church at Gairloch goes on to be referenced in a 1567 document written by Queen Mary, because by this point, post-Reformation, this had become the parish church. Loads has happened over the years in Gairloch Church, and again I'm conscious in half an hour I'm giving such a whistle-stop tour of some of these, but have a listen to this little extract. The presbytery was much concerned about the abominations taking place in Gairloch parish, such as the sacrificing of bulls, the adoring of wells, the foretelling of life and death and journeys by a hollow stone, and other superstitions, monuments and stones tedious to rehearse, and in particular those associated with Isle Marie. Repeated instructions were given to the minister of Gairloch to put a stop to these events, and he did his best. So it's recorded in the minutes. Dingwall, 6th of August 1678. That day, Mr. Roderick Mackenzie, minister at Gairloch, by his letter to the presbytery, declared that he had summoned to his officer this presbytery day Sir Hector Mackenzie of Mellon in the parish of Gairloch, his sons and grandson, for the sacrificing of one bull in a heathenish manner in the island of St Rufus, commonly called Elan Mowry, in Loch Ewe, for the recovering the health of Christian Mackenzie, spouse to the said Hector Mackenzie, who was sick. So they've sacrificed this bull, but as I've said before, there's a lot of crossing over, kind of keeping a foot in all camps and doing everything you can, particularly if there's illness and people are worried and frightened. They're doing whatever they can do. They're probably praying as well. The church in Gairloch was in need of complete repairs by the 1700s, and a new church was completed in 1791. the current building as it is, although it's changed inside through renovations in 1909 and the 1960s, but the outside is it's the same building. Now, I'm only going to tell the stories of 2 more churches, and you've no idea how hard it is, especially given the size of Inverness-shire and how many fascinating and diverse church stories there are across the county. And I haven't done any for Nairnshire, so I'll need to come back to that as well. Now, within the collections at the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness, as you will know, is the wonderful Margaret McDougall collection. Honestly, this woman, I just love her. And this includes a volume, a big volume, mostly handwritten, in which she records the history of religion in Inverness and the story of every single church, and what's happened there and when it was built and when repairs were done and what they cost and so many things. So you can imagine how hard it was to select one. When she wrote this in 1943, there were 19 churches in existence, including 11 Church of Scotland and 3 Episcopal churches, and Inverness was a lot smaller in 1943. So it's a bit of a nightmare to pick from Meg's records of which one to talk about. So I'm going to start with this quick overview from this volume about the state of religion in Inverness in general. She says the citizens of Inverness have always shown a remarkable steadiness in religious matters. They did not go to extremes, and from examination of the records available, appear to have displayed considerable tolerance in most matters affecting church affairs. When the papal system was overthrown in 1560 and the Reformed Church was established. At this time, there were several churches and chapels in the town, together with a Blackfriars monastery, now often wrongly called a Greyfriars monastery. But of all of these, only the old High Church remains, the present building occupying the site of the earlier parish church buildings. At the time of the Reformation, the church appears to have taken a prominent part in the affairs of the town, as indeed it had done for centuries. Town and church were closely bound to one another. Meetings of the town council were frequently held in the Blackfriars monastery, and on several occasions monks or other ecclesiastical personages held the appointment of town clerks. That's just a very small section. She goes on for pages and pages detailing the general history of religion in Inverness, as well as the particular for specific churches. Now, I've done previous episodes on the Methodist Church in Inverness and on the Old High, so I'm not going to even refer to those, and I think I'll do a cathedrals episode at some point, so I'll come back to Inverness Cathedral. But I've decided to go with St Mary's Gaelic Church, the third charge, the site which is now the much loved and famous everywhere Leakey's Bookshop. Okay, so let's see what Meg has to say about the Gaelic Church. The present St Mary's Gaelic Church in Inverness, the Leakey's building, was built in 1792 on the site of the former Gaelic Church built in 1649. In the old records of the town and the Kirk session, the Gaelic Church is referenced as the Highland Church and the Irish Church on account of the services therein being held in the Gaelic language. On the 14th of June 1649, the Town Council of Inverness gave the sum of £1,000 Scots for the building of a new kirk for the Irish Church. Nonagenarian, in his reminiscences, tells us that the principal event concerned with this building was it being converted into a hospital and prison for the followers of Prince Charles Edward immediately after the Battle of Culloden in 1746. Among the prisoners were Provost Hossack and ex-Provost Fraser, both lukewarm supporters of the House of Brunswick and therefore suspected of being Jacobite sympathisers. Nonagenarian remembers seeing in a vault on the south side of the church the large common coffin, as it was called in the Gaelic. It was formerly used to take any bodies of common people and strangers to the grave, in which they were then slipped without ceremony. The last time it was used was during the burials of those who died of wounds received at the Battle of Culloden. Really interesting. You know about the mort cloth which is shared, but interesting that there's a shared coffin as well. So there had been a Gaelic charge earlier, but it seemed like they didn't have a dedicated building until this building was built in 1649. And Meg goes on to note in her records that the Gaelic church was also used as the mortuary for the bodies of disowned persons. The bodies remained there until they were either claimed or interred. It also had a physical connection to the Old High. Now, people who, I'm seeing comments there about Leakeys, so people who know Leakeys will know that it's situated right next to the Old High Church. So there was a passageway that connected the two. And Meg goes on to describe the Gaelic Church's development in this way. She says, I give this as my own opinion after reading all available records to date. By the middle of the 18th century, the structure of the Gaelic Church, built in 1649, was in a very bad condition and repairs were frequently made. By April 1776, the congregation was so large that it could not all be accommodated within the church. For many years, the sacrament of the Lord's Supper had been transferred to the chapel yard on account of the church building being insufficient to accommodate the vast number of people who attended. In April 1791, the Kirk Session received a report upon the condition of the church. And as a result of that report, it made me smile reading it, because they get the tradespeople say, so we could knock down this wall, knock down that, change all the windows, change this, but leave basically a bit of the thing standing. And eventually they go, oh, for goodness sake, please just build a new church, because that's going to be much easier than this moving bits and changing, adding little bits in. So a new church was built for the Gaelic Church, with seating for 1,400. Really interesting. And Meg's notes detail some of the interesting contributions that were made via collections in the Gaelic Church in the 1700s. This congregation contributed to building churches in Philadelphia, supporting foundlings and orphans, and supported the printing of a Gaelic translation of the Bible, as well as numerous other things. So it's an interesting story, that church, and also had quite a lot of debates between the different trades and guilds, and arguing about who should be allocated what seats and so on. When the building was rebuilt, or when there was repairs done, the incorporated trades offered to contribute money towards the construction, and as a result they were allocated 1/6 of the seats in the church, at a time when possessing a seat or a pew was something that was very, very jealously guarded. In 1954, the Gaelic Church was sold to the Free Presbyterian congregation because the congregation had transferred to St Mary's in Dalnay. And now, as I mentioned, the building houses Leakey's bookshop, loved by a lot of people, including me, as you might guess. Now, the final church that I want to talk about, and I know we're going to go on, but go over, but I haven't been here for a few weeks, so I'm sure you'll forgive me. And it is hard to pick the final one. I wanted to talk about Davie and Dunlickety. I wanted to talk about Bewley Priory and the chip shop next to it called the Friary, which always makes me smile. Lagan, Alvey, there's loads of churches that are very, very interesting as you go down the county. But the final one I am going to talk about today is the Eaclish Earnan, the Iron Church, or the Floating Church, because I find this story absolutely fascinating. And I could have just read you the entire booklet that we hold about this, written by George Fox. But I need to condense it, so I'm just going to read you some sections about this absolutely remarkable church in Struntian in Lochaber. So George Fox writes, the Floating Church was built at Port Glasgow on the East Yard by John Wood and John Reid. It was launched between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock on the 12th of June 1846. The church was 78 feet long and 24 feet broad and 17 feet high, and it seated a congregation of over 400. These are just a few technical details. To see the reason why all this should come about, we have to go back to the year 1843. Now, I've done a full episode on what happened in 1843 and the disruption and the creation of the Free Church. So if you haven't had a look at that, then please do watch that episode, because this was such a pivotal moment, in Scottish history, just like the Reformation was in 1560. This moment in 1843, where the break that was caused from the established church. This came about various concerns that were had from ministers and congregations around various issues, but particularly around the fact that the landowners, the heritors, had the authority to decide who was going to be the minister, and that they felt that didn't give them kind of religious freedom and autonomy to make those decisions themselves. It was not until the 23rd of May that the famous Act of Separation and the Deed of Demission was signed, giving birth to the Free Church of Scotland. Some 480 ministers signed the deed, and in doing so, they signed away all security that they had. In this material age that we live in, would you do that? The breakaway meant no money, no wages, no church buildings, no manse. The Church of Scotland was partially subsidised by the government. The wages had come from the congregations. Their future were uncertain. He goes on to say, I am of the opinion that the word disruption is an understatement. In cities and towns, accommodation would have been fairly easy to acquire, but in the country, it was a different kettle of fish. One Free Church minister at Fort William had to build his house of turf on the common grazing because none of his parishioners would allocate any land in case of the reprisals that would be taken out on them by the landowners who would have supported the established church. Such acts were taken out against the Free Church in Strontian and in villages all over Scotland. For some time, open-air services for this congregation in Strontian were held on the seashore between the high and low-level watermarks because this is Crown property. So no one could tell them off or evict them from Crown property. Gradually, the landlord of this community relented and allowed that new Free Church congregation to hold services outside in a piece of land that was a little bit like a natural amphitheatre with minister's stone, meaning that attendees for the newly formed Free Church congregation would walk miles to worship outdoors no matter the weather, so rain and snow, as anyone who is familiar with Lochaber will know. So the booklet goes on to say, who first thought of an amphibious church? I've yet to discover. Probably someone who didn't appreciate the healthy outdoor meetings, and you can't be evicted from the sea. Something that could house between 400 or 500 people. Some say between 700 and 1,000, but I'm of the opinion that that's an exaggeration. Some £1,400 was raised locally for the vessel. This was a remarkable amount of money from a people who were living below the breadline. At this time, the potato famine was rife, part of their main diet was removed, and money was very scarce, and yet they found money to allocate to the construction of the floating church. The bow of this boat held the vestry, the pulpit, and sleeping accommodation for any visiting ministers who came, as well as Free Church College students who would come in the summers and then go out throughout the parish to minister. It was tugged along the Clyde after construction and then sailed for a day and a half around the Mull of Kintyre to end in Ardnastang Bay. Ironically, it says that the best anchorage, the safest, most logical anchorage, would have been right in front of the landowner's house, but they decided that that wasn't in the best of taste, so they moved it along a little bit. Ferrying the passengers to and from the church was done by rowing boat and fixed line between the church and the land. The occupants of the boats would pull themselves along on the fixed lines. Even with the fixed lines, it would have taken a long time to ferry all the parishioners out to the church. It must have been a godsend then, when one night a great storm plus a very high tide made the floating church break its moorings, and it was driven up onto the beach, which was nice and level and sandy. In this location, it stayed as a church until the permanent church was built in 1873. After the church was driven up the beach, Sir Thomas Mills Riddle, the landowner, relented and allowed the Free Church to build a building. When that church, the floating church, was eventually broken up, pieces of the wooden parts of the structure were used for souvenirs as well as for building materials. And all that remains today of that floating church is the little jetty that was used by the Free Church congregation to go out to the church. So I'm going to leave it there. I will definitely do more episodes on churches, if anyone. I'm assuming you're all as interested in it as I am. So thank you very much for joining me. Thank you for your patience in waiting for me to get back. I honestly could not have been back any earlier than I was. I hope you can join me next week. I'll be looking at the subject of women at work. Some really interesting stories in there as well. So a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we really do appreciate that. So thank you so much. Thank you for all your comments. I'm glad to see memories and comments and thoughts coming up. So thank you so much. Take care. Bye.